Welcome to Village Church Connections. I'm David Pavey. Some years ago, when serving as a pastor near London, in a small town with a large population of foreigners, a migrant I will call Petrit arrived in England from the Balkans to join his 25-year-old son and other young relatives who had reached the UK several months before him. His wife and young daughter turned up in England a few weeks later. All came clandestinely, hidden in trucks. Upon arrival, they registered with the government and were then, in a sense, legal illegal aliens until either given permission to remain or deported. Driving without a license or insurance was nothing to people coming to the UK from certain countries, though most of them knew how to drive. Petrit didn't, however, but his son talked him into buying an old banger of a car so they could drive to work in a neighboring town where father and son could earn money under the radar. A few days later, Petrit, with his son and teenage daughter along for the ride, managed to drive the car to a parking area off the road a few miles away from town. While father and son were walking around the car to inspect their investment, the front doors were wide open and the engine still running. The daughter jumped into the driver's seat and engaged reverse gear, inadvertently making the car lurch backwards and knocking both men to the ground. The son picked himself up and brushed himself off. The father just lay there, unconscious. Emergency services soon rushed Petrit to the hospital in Cambridge, one of the top centers for brain trauma patients in Europe. In the morning, a colleague and I packed our two cars with Petrit's relatives and we drove them to the hospital. There we found Petrit breathing, but still unconscious. A while later, a neurosurgeon called us into a counseling room to explain that when Petrit had arrived at the hospital, he was already brain dead. With many tears, the family agreed to pull the life support systems, and they watched their loved one gasp his last few breaths before passing into eternity. Weeping and wailing, they shattered the quietness of the hospital as nurses pulled the curtains around Petrit's bed so the body could be dealt with appropriately. The guilt-ridden daughter was screaming, "I killed my father!" The son was wailing, overwhelmed with guilt at having pushed his father to buy the car. It was heartrending. Our town social services graciously agreed to cover the cost of the burial, but for 5 days before the funeral, according to the culture, the family received visitors all day long at their home, where the corpse was laid out, regaled in a suit and a tie, and clutching a pack of Marlboros, even though he didn't smoke. I would sit with them by the hour, sometimes silently, sometimes making conversation, sipping coffee in a smoke-laden room, feeling the pain, bearing their burden. This is what a friend calls the ministry of presence. You can't do much to help, but at least you're there to identify with their experience. The women would cry hysterically and then socialize again, their anguish indescribable. Hopes for a better life in England had been shattered in a moment by the tragic and unnecessary loss of the family patriarch. Another spectre haunted them too, the possibility of being deported and having to leave Petrit's body in an English graveyard. On the day of the funeral, we had to accommodate many Balkan customs, like meeting at the house before going to the church and walking through the neighborhood behind the coffin. My wife Nancy played the prelude and postlude on the piano at the church, but there was to be no congregational singing. God gave special grace to my colleague and me with the service and with the burial. He did the welcome and eulogy, while I gave the message based on John 11. everything translated. About 100 attended, perhaps 60 of them from the Balkans. Several civil servants from local government offices attended. And finally, we laid Patrice's body to rest in the nearby cemetery, less than 6 months after his arrival in the United Kingdom. It was one long day, but our ministry to this needy family endeared us and the church to a host of immigrants. You know, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And we were seen as people who cared. The Apostle Paul urged Christians to carry each other's burdens and in that way fulfill the law of Christ, which was, of course, to love one another. We don't have to look far to find people carrying burdens that we could share. Sometimes practical, like the need to organize a funeral. Sometimes spiritual or emotional, like guilt, the burden of anxiety and sorrow, for example. Behind every door, there's a story. Say, whose burden are you helping to carry today? And thank you for tuning in to Village Church Connections.